السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل منذ العام 2011 كانت هنالك محاولات حثيثة لتأطير الحرب ضد سوريا على أنها حرب أهلية، الأمر الذي يعكس استراتيجية دعائية مخادعة وخبيثة وليس الحقيقة. يلاحظ المراقبون أن الطريقة الأكثر دقة لوصف الأحداث في سوريا هي بالحرب الجديدة، وهو مصطلح صاغته الأستاذة البريطانية في جامعة لندن سكول أوف إيكونومكس ماري كالدور، ولعله تعريف يتحدى مصطلح الحرب القديمة التي تم تطبيقها على النزاعات التي دارت خلال فترة الحرب الباردة، حيث تبرز في هذه الحرب الجديدة الفصائل المتحاربة المتعددة والمتنوعة التي توجد خارج نطاق تلك التابعة للدولة. الأسباب التي غالبا ما ترتبط بهويات حازمة للغاية، من بينها الدينية وأساليب القتال غير المتناظرة والإرهابية، طرق جديدة ومبتكرة لتمويل الحرب، من عمليات الاختطاف إلى تهريب المخدرات والأعضاء وتدويل الصراع من خلال تداعياته العسكرية والإنسانية، الأمر الذي يحول سيناريو الحرب إلى سيناريو دولي، وأخيراً استخدام وحشي للعنف يتجاوز الحدود الوطنية. ولعل كل هذه العناصر كانت حاضرة جزئياً أو كلياً في الحرب والصراع في سوريا. للحديث أكثر وبشكل معمق عن الصراع في سوريا والحرب عليها واستشراف الآتي والتطورات وتشريح كتاب سوريا في المنظور، يطيب لنا أن نستقبل مؤلف هذا الكتاب الثمين بمحتواه الدكتور بابلو صباغ من العاصمة الإسبانية مدريد، والباحث الميداني وأستاذ العلاقات الدولية في جامعة كومبلوتنسه. أهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Dr. Pablo Sabag, professor at Madrid Complutense University, expert on Syria, international relations, media, propaganda and war, and author of Syria in Perspective. Welcome to Min al-Dakhil from the inside, sir.
My pleasure to be in Min al-Dakhil. Thank you very much.
Pure pleasure to have you always. Well, this precious book, Syria in Perspective, from externally aggravated crisis to national reconstruction, a valuable, resourceful book. Dr. Sabag, as a writer who has published many books and dozens of articles on foreign media coverage of the Syrian crisis, on Syrian Christians, and Facebook during the global war against Syria, and on the Syrian diaspora, why Syria in Perspective? Is it an attempt to fill the gap between Syria's reality and its media misrepresentation and disinformation?
Exactly, that was the main purpose of this book, Syrian Perspective. I wanted to widen the focus on what was going on in Syria. In Syria, there was not just internal problems or internal circumstances. In Syria, many actors, foreign powers, intervened, and that aggravated the crisis. So I wanted to look at what was happening in Syria from a wider perspective. And of course, one of the purposes was to fill that gap between the media representation, which was always focusing on the internal issues of Syria and with not any deep view, and to fill it with reality. The complex reality of an ancient country like Syria, which is a very important country in the region of the Middle East.
Of course. So this book is the product of your academic approach to understand the Syrian crisis. What are the bottom lines that you have reached after this extensive field research and scholar sense, where you have compiled and combined English, French, Spanish, and Arabic scholarly texts with field research, sir?
Well, I'm a professor of history of propaganda at Madrid Complutense University, so my approach is always from the communication side of a crisis. So I think one of the main inputs of this book is the propaganda war. Mm-hmm. Of course, all the actors that intervene in Syria had a strategy of propaganda to try to explain or to convince people that what they were doing was the right thing to do. So I tried to uncover all these propaganda strategies and in some cases propaganda plots that added to the war. Mm-hmm. It's clearly that, you know, the Syrian crisis had internal and external causes, but without propaganda, I'm sure that it would have never been in the extent that we saw the last decade. So I think that's one of the main novelties of these books, the approach to the Syrian crisis from the prisma of communication, persuasion, propaganda, and all that. Of course, the book could have been named Syria in Perspectives in plural, mm-hmm. because besides the communication approach, I also talk about history, sociology, the military side of the crisis, and other issues like, you know, the geopolitics of the crisis. But the main bottom line is the communication aspect of the crisis.
Right. Let's expand the main themes that you have focused on, please, Dr. Pablo. Let's examine and anatomize, construe, and elucidate your book and its chapters in depth. Perhaps we can draw a semantic web of the main points of focus of Syria in perspective, please.
Yes, well, I start the book explaining the complexity of Syria. Syria is a very ancient country, mm-hmm. with a long history, and it's a very diverse country. It's very rich in its diversity in ethnic terms, but also in religious terms. So if you want to understand Syria, you have to take that into account. And you have to cross that with the way Syrians have devoted all their constitutions from the 1920s on, protecting that diversity. In Syria, the state is non-confessional in order to protect all, you know, that rich diversity of Syrian society. So it was important to show Syrian history and Syrian social features and characteristics. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, I explain in the book the reasons that are behind the crisis. I divide them in internal causes and external causes. Of course, Syria, as any other country, had problems in 2011, economic problems, social problems, political problems, and others. But mm-hmm. As I mentioned before, without the intervention of foreign powers, regional and global powers, the crisis would have been solved rather easily. But as we had this intervention, it was necessary to explain the goals of all the different powers, states that intervene, either
you mean, sir,
the Syrian state or yes.
Yes, you mean a premeditated intervention.
Exactly, that's right. It was a premeditated intervention, maybe in the making for many years before 2011. I mean, those countries that acted against not just the Syrian government, but against the Syrian state, used the situation that happened in Syria and other Arab countries in 2011 to promote and advance their permanent agendas. So we had some countries in the region that had economic interest, political interest to diminish Syria. But we also had the interest of big powers, in this case, mainly the United States and its allies, to try to divide Syria in many or little states. So Syria wouldn't be the important country it has always been in the region. Syria, as I mentioned before, has always been a very, very big player in the Middle East. And those powers that were intervening against Syria, they didn't like Syria had that position.
Right. To what do we owe the media and academic confusion when it comes to explaining the Syrian crisis and the complexity and the variety of this beautiful mosaic which were evident before 2011? Is it because of those dangerous dystopias that are often imposed through corrupting the use of the language to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable?
Of course, as we mentioned before, there were countries that had interest against Syria in the crisis, and to move on their agendas, they had to convince their public opinions, because they were going to waste a lot of money or invest a lot of money in trying to move forward their agendas. So they need a strategy to convince their public opinions that what they were doing in Syria was a right thing to do. In doing this, they use propaganda, they use the media. We are talking about states, and most of these states have very powerful television networks, news agencies, and they have a sort of collusion even with private media. So they framed the crisis in Syria first in this, naive approach of the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, which implies that it was something positive, which was clearly not, because when you have death and you have destruction and you have people leaving their houses, you cannot talk as a spring. It's rather a winter or even a hell than a spring.
Here, sir, allow me to ask you something, please. Why do you reckon that the war against Syria is not to be compared to what was happening in other countries at that time under the umbrella of what was termed the so-called Arab Spring? Does it fit more the term of a new war as coined and put by British professor Mary Kaldor?
Exactly. First, they tried to present this as a positive event, that is, it was going to finish very quickly, without death, without destruction. But as the same that happened in Libya and in other countries of the so-called mistakenly Arab Spring, well, the situation in Syria got out of hand in terms of bloodletting, in military terms, and so on. So these powers that were acting against Syria, they coined another tag, another label, which was the one of civil war. And in Syria, we didn't have a civil war, because what you need for a civil war is very clear. When you go to the academic literature, I'm talking about authors like Sambonis, Moro, or Calivas, they say very clear that the example of a proper civil war is the Spanish Civil War, fought between 1936 and 1939. You will not find a single of those conditions in Syria. So, in this case, you're right. The crisis in Syria fits better in the frame of what Professor Mary Kaldor calls a new war. What is a new war? It's a very vicious conflict without clear front lines, and where in one side maybe you can have official forces from the state, but in the other hand you have a collection of groups that you don't know who is in charge of those groups.
Factions. True.
Factions, exactly, factions, terrorist groups that use very, very nasty sources to advance sometimes not their own agendas, but the agendas of others.
Exactly.
And that's a new war in terms of Mary Kaldor. So in Syria, what is clear that we cannot talk about a civil war in any case.
Right. After a prolonged, complex, and arduous conflict, aggravated by an extraordinary amount of international pressure, do you believe, sir, that the Syrian state has overcome the worst of the crisis without collapsing, or are we dealing with remnants of a state?
For sure. I have just been in Syria some weeks ago. I have traveled frequently to Syria during the crisis, and the state is there. And the state is providing services to the people of Syria. Of course, facing a lot of problems, specifically because of coercive measures imposed by the European Union and the United States against the Syrian people and the Syrian authorities and the Syrian state. But the Syrian state is providing health services, is providing education, it's coping with the hardship of economic situation. The Syrian state has faced with all its capabilities the COVID-19 pandemic. So yes, the Syrian state has overcome this very grave crisis in its history, the worst crisis in the history of the modern Syrian state since 1946, when the country got its full independence after the occupation of the French. So yes, the Syrian state is there, and it's running properly.
Well, Syrian Perspective, yes, it focuses on the internal causes and the significant interference in it by external, regional, and global powers. Yes, it considers the propaganda and military dimensions of the crisis. Yes, you finally suggest how Syria might evolve in the medium term. How, sir? Illuminate us.
Internally, it's clear that Syria has to rebuild itself. And when I'm talking about rebuilding, I'm not talking just about buildings, material reconstruction. It also has to think about the internal problems that led to the crisis in 2011. I'm very happy to see these days that I have been in Syria that the main issue, what is in the DNA of the Syrian society, it has not been affected by the crisis, rather the opposite. I mean, the wish of the Syrian people, the will of the Syrian people to live together, regardless the different religion, the different sect, or the different ethnicity of that diverse Syria. That's very important because that will help Syria to move forward quickly to rebuild the country, to rebuild confidence between the different parts of society, and to think that there is a future for Syria. That's very important. So I think even though Syria now is facing very, very hardship in terms of those coercive measures, and of course, Syria, as the rest of the world, is facing economic crisis regarding other situations in the world and so on. But in Syria, there is the will to live together, and there is the will to overcome definitely these bad years. And of course, I also realize that Syrian people have learned about the crisis, and they have learned that they built a state, a solid state after independence, and that state was at risk, was a stake. So they have learned that they have to protect the state, that they have to value the state, and developed little by little, but not create this sort of havoc that happened in 2011. And especially, they have understood clearly, Syrian people, that they cannot trust some of the outside powers that have intervened or interfered in Syria. So I think the Syrian people have taken many lessons after this, and that's the main brick or the base to build up or rebuild the country.
So you have dedicated a chapter about geopolitics. In this sense, how do you read the impact and repercussions in Bilad al-Sham of the crisis in Ukraine, Russia, that is accompanied by a classical strategy of deceiving propaganda wheel that, in this occasion, dangerously pushes the crisis forward with worldwide ramifications, as it did with Syria?
First of all, and it's a very good question, yours, because you have linked it with propaganda. And what we are seeing now in the crisis regarding Ukraine, Russia, and all that, we are seeing the same strategy and plots of propaganda that we saw before in Syria. From a Syrian perspective, it was very easy to understand this propaganda scheme in the case of the crisis in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. The second thing, in terms of geopolitics, it's clearly that we are witnessing the building or the reshaping of the world in a different way. We are going to have a more multilateral world. Mm-hmm. That sort of flat globalization that the United States pretended to impose after the end of the Cold War, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, it's over. Now what we are going to have is a world where it's going to be different powers in different areas of the world, and that will make different countries like Syria, for instance, or other countries in the Middle East, to choose partners. Mm-hmm. In this case, Syria is in a privileged position because Syria was forced to change avant la lettre. It was forced to choose partners before the last decade. Syria has a very clear position where it is, and Syria is with Russia. It has a deep alliance with the Russian state, not just because material or security interest, but also because there are very, very long historic, cultural, and even religious links that connect these two countries.
Right. Allow me to ask you here, we know that you are a big fan and someone who is very keen on the rugby sport. Might you, sir, elaborate how this sport developed in Syria during the worst years of the crisis, in the sense that it has been a good example of how the Syrian society is alive and kicking?
For sure. Rugby started in Syria in 2004, but in a very informal way. There were just two teams of British and French and other expatriate people living in Syria. But it was not an official sport, it was not federated. When the crisis started, these foreign people that were playing rugby as a hobby in Syria, they left the country. But the very few Syrian people that were also playing rugby, they decided to organize rugby from a national perspective, and they wanted to have a rugby committee recognized, acknowledged by the National Sport Federation, but also by the international rugby committees and federations and all that. So a group of very brave Syrians facing all kinds of challenges, they keep on training, they keep on practicing the sport in very bad conditions.
Against all odds.
Against all the odds, and they organize the sport in a proper way. So now Syria has more than 500 Syrian rugby players. We are talking about male and female. We have one of the ambassadors of the sport for the Asian continent and the whole world. It's a Syrian lady, which is the name is Sarah Abdel-Baki, and Syria is playing in international tournaments and doing a lot of things. Well, as you mentioned before, Sinat, this is a story of hope, is a story of
resilience. This is the spirit that has always been that of the Syrians. Yes, as you have once written, maybe time has finally come for real powers to end the abduction of the international community by those with such a great consideration of themselves, but so little about the pernicious consequences that their bombastic but hollow policies have On others, Dr. Pablo Sabag, professor at Complutense University of Madrid and author of Syria in Perspective. Thank you very much, sir, for your insightful writings and sharp perspective.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure to have you, sir. ودائما الشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.